Let me start by stating clearly that and I really do mean the environmental and sustainability challenge we all face internationally is climate change. So what is climate change? Apart from the obvious, I'm going to suggest something different. If it's a problem, then exactly what kind of problem is it? And are we, especially those of us in the Western world, simply irresponsible? Is this a problem of human behavior? Does this point to the failure of government somehow? Are there demons in a corporate back room somewhere generating enough hot air to warm their own domicile and everybody else's, whether they want it or not? What's climate change? There may be some truth to all of what I've just suggested, but let me go out on a limb and say that first and foremost, climate change is a problem of human rights, of universal human rights, largely unrecognized and seldom respected. We live with a system of production and consumption, as others have said, where growth, making a profit, what some call accumulation, is a right far more important than doing whatever is necessary to respect and protect the dignity, health, and welfare of significant others on the planet. What I find disturbing about many discussions of climate change are, number one, the way in which the language, images, and emphases focus on the science of climate change and the impacts of climate change on the biosphere, with a heavy emphasis on species, interestingly enough, other than our own. And secondly, the way in which the implications for human beings, for all of us, are articulated. That articulation focuses on the implications for human health, welfare, and personal well-being. And so you're going to say, well, what the hell is this guy talking about? What in the world is wrong with that? Well, the emphasis given to human health, welfare, and well-being is inevitably what I would call body-centered. The focus is most often on individuals portrayed in their struggle with climate change, hauling water inordinate distances, being forced out of their homes by flooding, or speaking to the camera about falling through the ice on a lake that's normally frozen at this time of year. N equals 1, that is the focus on the individual, makes for a darn good story. Something that appeals to our sense of individual responsibility. Rarely, because it's impossible to avoid, is this journalistic fetish broken by images of whole communities or groups of people forced onto their rooftops by a catastrophic event, or made to migrate and set up shop in a United Nations High Commission for Refugees tent on the edge of an encroaching desert. These events happen to others. There's an interest but a disconnect here. We live in a world with too few threads to pull us together, to make us an integral part of the picture. My world is mine and theirs is theirs. By the way, there's nothing necessarily wrong with this imagery. The problem is that it's simply not sufficient. It suggests that climate change is a physical problem, whether we're talking about a melting polar ice cap or glaciers disappearing, polar bear having a hard time feeding on seals thanks to a receding ice shelf, or people with a diminished food supply, which, by the way, is exactly what's happening in the area of the world where I work mostly, the Canadian Arctic. This emphasis on biophysical impacts and the other has serious implications both for how we understand the problem and what's to be done. In a culture where we are all alone together, it leaves us feeling personally responsible for making changes to our lives and lifestyles in order that we, and especially our children, might not suffer. The sense of responsibility we feel for others is somewhat present but diminished by the absence of a discourse, a way of talking about the problem that resolutely sews us together. I'm not suggesting that changing how we live our lives, what we consume by way of energy, is not important, but I believe we have seriously underestimated the implications of climate change and what it means for how we need to live, the values we need to examine, and our relationship to and ways of organizing both production and consumption. Climate change suggests a revolution in how we organize daily life, and to put it bluntly, And I guess I can say this as an academic, someone who's not running for public office and kind of a free spirit, not having to pander to a long list of public interests whose reactions might damage my career. What ought to be in question here is, simply put, the logic of capitalism. A system predicated on growth, individualism, and in some circles a definition of freedom that means minimal state or community, read collective, interference in the right of individuals, and corporations are defined as individuals in law, to pursue their interests. And all of this, of course, is predicated on a belief that somehow this is a self-regulating system that works for the good of all of us. And by the way, the state-mandated capitalism of the former Soviet Union fared no better and likely worse in respecting both the environment and human rights. So what we need is a generation, and this is where you come in, of imaginative young people ready and able to rewrite ways in which we organize labor, community, and engender respect for both others and the planet on which we live. So having myself lived and worked in the South Pacific, East Africa, and as I've mentioned, especially the Canadian Arctic, I simply don't believe we can continue to organize how we meet human needs using the badly flawed logic of capitalist expansion. The only out, if you want to keep this system, is twofold. A technological fix that lets us have our cake and eat it too. For example, the insanely expensive idea of pumping CO2 underground, likely using public money, which is what this government is doing right now with TransAlta Utilities in Alberta. And a system of regulation that prohibits initiatives clearly not in the public interest. Well, let's see what happens to the proposal to build a yacht basin in Victoria Harbour to coddle the 50-meter yachts of the rich and famous when it comes to the power of regulation. My faith in these possibilities, given our track record, I must admit, is severely limited. Since the mid-1960s, with the demise, and there's already been some discussion of this, but since the demise of non-secular institutions in Canada, and not just Canada and Canadian culture, the rise of secular life, the importance of the commodity embraced by malls and patrons from coast to coast, the importance of appearances and material success have engendered a crisis of meaning with social and environmental implications that I think are unparalleled in human history. I'm not suggesting that the Catholic, Calvinist, and Judeo-Christian traditions, which largely dominated Canadian culture until the mid-1960s, produced great results for the status of women, issues of racism, sexual orientation, or an appreciation of social class and class differences in Canadian society. Only that a culture that does not take moral philosophy and questions about who we are, how we ought to live, and what constitutes our obligations to others seriously is a country headed for a form of bankruptcy as serious as the financial meltdown of 2008. These two bankruptcies, one moral, the other financial, are integrally connected. The emphasis our culture places on an education steeped in science, math, physics, chemistry, and getting to know the world in which we live is delightfully wasted on young people with a lot of knowledge, seriously unattuned to the wisdom and sensibilities needed to make judicious use of so much knowing. So what is climate change? If not hotly debated chemistry, is climate change and something happening mostly? Is it something that's, happening mostly to Inuit living in polar regions? Isn't it something happening to residents of the Maldives Islands, somewhere out there living on low-lying coral atolls, rapidly disappearing beneath rising seas? Or perhaps it's the experience of tribespeople in the Sahel watching their livestock disappear beneath a perpetual whirl of sand. It's something that here in Victoria requires a bit more suntan lotion on a hot summer day. Climate change is all of these. But the realities of climate change have been seriously underplayed. Climate change is and must increasingly become a discourse and action on human rights.